total public debt shatters records.
Federal debt load snowballing in recent months, adding about $1 trillion every 100 days.
But 13 piles of cash as tall as the Washington Monument.
U.S. debt clock.
This is a national debt clock.
Did you know the USA has something called the National Debt Clock? It's been there in New York since the late 80s, just showing off. So what's it for? Well, this big digital scoreboard displays how much money the country owes to different people. We're talking countries, companies, and regular folks who lent Uncle Sam some cash, mostly in the form of bonds. Back in 1989, the debt was about $3 trillion. But guess what? Fast forward to today, and it's grown to over $30 trillion. Yeah, that's a whole lot of money. And if we divide it by households, it's pretty shocking. Imagine this, each household owing more than $300,000. Let's break down what's going on with the US government. So here's the scoop. They're constantly spending more money than they're bringing in. Basically, they're living beyond their means. And starting from this year, the US is shelling out more cash on interest payments for its debt than on national defense. Now, here's the thing. It's not like they're cutting back on military spending. Nope, it's just that paying off that debt has become super expensive. Nowadays, the US Treasury Department is forking out a whopping $1.8 trillion just to cover the interest on the debt. And guess what? By 2033, that number's expected to shoot up to around $4 trillion. Think about this. When the government's spending more money than it's making, it's like someone racking up a huge credit card bill but not paying it off. And you know what happens when you don't pay off your credit card bill? Yep, those interest payments start piling up real fast. So what's the big deal with all this debt stuff? Well, let's break it down. First, when the government's paying out all this cash and interest, there's less money to go around for other important stuff. We're discussing things like education, healthcare, and keeping the lights on in government buildings. And here's another thing to consider. When a country's drowning in debt, it can make investors real nervous. They start worrying that the government won't be able to pay back all the money it owes. And you know what happens when investors get nervous? They start demanding higher interest rates on those loans. And that just makes the whole debt problem even worse. Now, let's discuss the long-term effects of all this debt. When the government spends so much money on interest payments, there's less cash left over for investments that could help grow the economy. We're talking about building new businesses, upgrading infrastructure, and creating jobs. So, how did we end up in this mess? Well, let's rewind back a bit. People thought the debt was under control for about 2 decades after the debt clock showed up. But then came the big financial crisis of 2008, which changed everything. Here's what went down. The country's economy took a nosedive, and at the same time, our debt started piling up. Our economy tanked suddenly, so we had to start spending more money than we were bringing in to try to get things back on track. And once we started down that road, there was no turning back. The debt just kept on growing and growing. By 2013, after a slow but steady climb, our debt skyrocketed past the 100% mark for the first time. And you know what that means? It means we owe more money than our entire economy produces yearly. Yeah, it's kind of like having a credit card bill that's bigger than your paycheck. So, long story short, the financial crisis of 2008 threw us into a tailspin, and we've been playing catch-up ever since. With our debt reaching record levels, it's going to take some serious effort to get ourselves back on solid ground. When economists want to see how well a country is doing financially, they often look at its debt compared to its gross domestic product, or GDP. Think of GDP as the total value of everything produced by a country. The debt to GDP ratio is like a health check for a country's economy, showing if it owes more than it produces. This ratio has been quite high for years, which isn't necessarily bad, but it's important to keep an eye on it. This high level stayed pretty constant for almost 10 years. However, everything changed when the pandemic hit. Governments around the world, including ours, had to act fast. To prevent the economy from crashing, they gave money directly to businesses and people to help them keep buying things and keep the economy moving. The Federal Reserve, like our country's central bank, played a big part in this. They lowered interest rates almost to zero, making it very cheap to borrow money. This was initially a great help because it made it easier for people and businesses to survive the sudden economic stop caused by the pandemic. But borrowing a lot of money and creating new money can lead to inflation, which means that money buys less and prices for things like food and rent go up. As prices began to rise quickly, the Federal Reserve had to do something to try and stabilize things. so they raised the interest rates again. This made borrowing money more expensive, which helps to slow down how much money is out there and can help keep prices from going up too fast. During this time, there was a lot of disagreement on the best approach to handle the economy. The Democrats, for instance, generally supported more spending. They argued that it was necessary to spend more to protect the economy and help those who were hit hardest by the pandemic. This kind of spending can be controversial because it increases the country's debt, and the taxpayers eventually need to cover these costs. Every year in Washington, the same routine unfolds when it's time to balance the budget. The decision makers steer clear of the tough choices until the very last moment. Then, as if on cue, a last-minute compromise swoops in to save the day. However, this routine does little more than postpone the real issues, as it doesn't tackle the underlying problems at all. The major credit rating agencies are well aware of this pattern. These agencies assess how likely the country is to repay its debts. Recently, Fitch, which is one of these agencies, took a drastic step by downgrading the United States from its top AAA rating. This downgrade is a big deal. It's like going from a straight-A student to a B student. They made this decision after watching endless debates in Congress about the national deficit, which is when the government spends more than what it collects. But there's more to the story. The constant political chaos in Washington also influenced their decision heavily. This instability signals that the US might not be the safest bet for lending money. Fitch also predicted that by 2025, the US debt to GDP ratio would reach 118%. This means that the country's debt will be 118% of what its economy produces in a year. To give you an idea, that's 3 times higher than what is typical in other similar countries. By lowering the US credit rating, Fitch is basically warning Washington that it needs to fix its budget strategy or things could get worse. These budget debates aren't just political squabbles. They have real, tangible impacts. They affect the country's ability to borrow money cheaply. If the US continues to lose credibility, borrowing costs could rise, slowing down economic growth and making everything from government projects to personal loans more expensive for everyone. The downgrade serves as a serious reminder that the US needs to address its debt issues. Ignoring them could lead to higher interest rates and a weaker economic position globally. When Congress discusses the budget and debt, it's not just about the next fiscal year. It's about maintaining the financial health and stability of the nation. Raising taxes is another possible solution, but it's a move that politicians are reluctant to make, particularly during an election year when they are wary of upsetting voters. These 3 tactics, stimulating economic growth, cutting government expenditures, and increasing taxes, were key components of the government's strategy under President Clinton to balance the budget to eliminate the national debt by 2012. However, the economic landscape has drastically changed due to the government's interventions during the significant financial crisis and recent global pandemic. Both Democratic and Republican parties have utilized government funds to avert economic catastrophe and stimulate growth. But efforts to reduce the national deficit have been lacking. It's easy for Democrats to blame Republicans and vice versa for the fiscal issues we're facing today. Yet, both parties have over the years made decisions that have led to the huge deficit we see now. Is the United States heading towards a financial crisis? Are our politicians truly capable of addressing our mounting debt? Share your thoughts below. Like, leave comments, and subscribe for more insights.